to Innovating Leadership, Co-Creating Our Future. I'm your host, Maureen Metcalf, CEO and founder of the Innovative Leadership Institute, where leadership meets innovation and strategy becomes results. Every senior leader has sat in a room where a decision that looked sound on paper, in the data, and in the room produced the wrong outcome. Not because the strategy was flawed, not because the market shifted, but because the people making that decision brought forces into the room that no governance framework had accounted for. Today, we're going to examine those forces directly. Our guest, I am delighted to interview, Manfred Kets Vries of INSEAD, one of the world's most influential scholars at the intersection of leadership, psychology, and organizational behavior. So welcome. It's a genuine pleasure to have you here.
It's very nice seeing you.
So you've introduced the idea of inner theater, the deep psychological patterns leaders carry into every decision, every room, every institutional dynamic they create. How should organizations think about the inner theater of their leaders as a systemic risk, something that belongs on the board radar aside strategy and finance, rather than just something for them to deal with personally?
Above the Temple of Apollo in ancient Greece was written, you might recall that, although you may not be a Greek scholar, know thyself. But know thyself is very difficult. And I'm always surprised how little self-knowledge executives have about their own behavior. And becomes even worse, the higher they go into in certain positions, the less they sometimes get the kind of feedback they need to have a better knowledge of themselves. I mean, I have written coming back to your comment, 100 years ago, I wrote a book with my colleague, Danny Miller, called The Neurotic Organization, which has become a little bit of a classic, I guess. That's probably the first attempt to show the relationship between leadership style and corporate culture and strategy. And so we tried to create some kind of taxonomy, partially influenced by my colleague at the time, Henry Mintzberg, who was the structuralist of organizations. And actually, Danny Miller was our doctoral student, which was interesting for both of Henry and myself. And the inner theater idea, by the way, is a psychoanalytic concept, which there has been some precedence about that. Anyhow, when I did my seminar, what always struck me was the lack of self-knowledge on the part of the executives and how little they knew their colleagues. And actually, since it was a modular program, the first thing they would do is, after the first week, they would rush to their office and really have some meaningful conversation with their people and the people who make up the executive team to get a better sense of them, not just talking about the weather and whatever, some figures, but really have a better understanding of what made those people tick, coming back to inner theater. And of course, in the typology, we look at certain executive behavior, some very typical dysfunctionality which reverberates into the organization is things like micromanagement. It's a very typical one. Mm-hmm. And I have one executive who is, as a client, who is a micromanager. And I laugh at him sometimes and say, listen, you have a lot of idiots working for you when I listen to you, quite a few idiots. The problem is, if you fire them and get some competent people, you have a lot of free time. And that's a problem. Because you have a lot of free time, what are you going to do with yourself? You might get depressed. It's a paradox, of course. He complains about his life. He complains that he has no life. At the same time, he has created a situation. So micromanagement is the bread and butter of psychotherapists, I can tell you that. It's all over the place. And of course, it reverberates in the organization. People want more details. There's a funny story, which I sometimes tell. It's called The Flowers of Catherine the Great. You probably never heard it. You have heard of Catherine the Great, the Tsarina of Russia. Apparently, there was a person who went to the garden of Catherine the Great, the castle somewhere, the palace somewhere in St. Petersburg. And in the middle of the garden, there was a soldier standing. So there was a very curious person, like you, Maureen. And he said to the soldier, what are you doing there? I said, I don't know. So this man was quite curious and said, I have to follow it up, and went to the sergeant. He said, why is this person standing in the middle of the garden? I don't know. But he kept on going, real detective, and finally found out that 100 years before, Catherine the Great was walking in that garden and saw this beautiful flower. She called the soldier and said, you stand here so nobody steps on this flower. 100 years later, the same soldier was standing there. And that's what happened when you talk about organizations. A new CEO comes in wants a certain kind of information, it's added, and you get a lot of social dysfunctionality or social defenses, whatever it might be. And the same thing when you talk about a reverberating effect. If you have a bully type of a CEO, and we start to format the mouse and you get certain information, that information will not come anymore. That's gone. Very quickly, he's surrounded by sycophants who tell him what he... And now, I want to stress something here, which is rather important. We make a lot of negative comments about narcissism. But you are narcissistic. We all are somewhat narcissistic. We need narcissism. First, self-confidence and things. It needs a certain dose of narcissism. Otherwise, you can survive. But it can also become pathological. And the Greeks, of course, I come back to the Greeks, which have had a lot of interesting insights, have this marvelous word called hubris, which means excessive pride. And what I see always, too often, and that's the reason you need checks and balances, that an executive becomes a CEO, and people say, what a fantastic meeting you're on. He likes that. When a person would say, listen, you could have done better, maybe you don't want this person around anymore. And so you get this kind of Greek chorus finally, and slowly the person... So what I'm trying to say is, Plato wrote about a philosopher king, which is fantastic. And of course, the role model of philosopher king is Marcus Aurelius. You might have remember the film Gladiator, and there's Marcus Aurelius and all these philosophical ideas. But even Marcus Aurelius, the real philosopher king, the emperor at the time of Rome, the most powerful person in the world, he appointed his son Commodus as his successor, who was a total asshole, to say it very plainly. So what I'm trying to say is, every leader needs a fool, needs some countervailing powers. Now, they can be structurally built in, that you have certain expiration dates, which you have in democracies and things like that. That's the danger by autocracy. You might have a very enlightened person, and of course, the role model very often is politicians given is the man who runs Singapore, who built up Singapore. But even there were some hiccups. And family got also quite involved. So you cannot trust a person, how enlightened the person is, without checks and balances. That's what I'm trying to say. So you need countervailing powers. Now, coming back to the board business, we have this fantastic executive, but he suddenly starts to scream at people and things like that. Can you help him? There's some dysfunctionality. Of course, later on became a status symbol. So how can we make good people even better? But the real trick is, if you have the top executive team not aligned, it is very expensive. It's very expensive. And that's where I have spent a lot of energy on. And to help my coaches, and I did a lot of coaching training, and coaching is not mass production. I can talk to 1,000 people or more. I want actually for 20,000. But coaching is small. It's bricolage, as the French call it. Needs some information. And so I went into psychometrics. Yes, me in psychometrics. That's not my strength, but I managed to find the best psychometrician in France by accident. And we teamed up. And so I developed a lot of 360 questionnaires. 360, because I don't believe self-assessment alone. That's the social desirability factor gets into the place. I developed some of them, and you also see the different roles people play. I developed one called JAM, the Global Executive Leadership Mirror, which is quite a sophisticated piece of instrument. The pain in the neck, by the way, to fill it out. And particularly if you are the CEO, you have to fill it out for everybody else because it becomes a real nightmare. And then the other one is the leadership archetype questionnaire, the different roles executives play. So some people are very good strategists, very good deal makers, good coaches, intrapreneurs. So you have different roles. And that is very important. When you look at executive meetings, you talk about strategy, about risks and things like that. And that's where probably some of my ideas come into place, people look, but they don't see. What are the elephants in the room? What are the real elephants in the room? Are they discussable? Can you talk about it? It's funny. When the first time I went to America, I went to the Harvard Summer School. I remember 70 years old. And people say, how are you? And you're supposed to say, fine, how are you? That's the ritual. But I had no idea. So I said, I don't feel so well today. And they look at me like something was wrong with me. Obviously, there was something wrong with me. So what I'm trying to say is that I try to teach, to educate the executives to look and see, to really try to listen to the other sounds, and also be aware of they may not be so grandiose as they think they are. There's something called transference in clinical literature. You probably know what it means. I mean, no relationship is a new relationship. All relationships are colored by previous relationship. So if you have a very autocratic father, and you always had fights with your father, it's a good possibility you see about someone who reminds you of your father, bang, off you go. And so and of course, when a person gets into power, it's still the same person. Suddenly becomes promoted to CEO, people start to behave differently towards them. And they should become more aware of those factors. That the moment you're in a position of power, now coming back to Kissinger's comment we talked about earlier, power is the greatest aphrodisiac, people start to behave differently. And also that, by the way, and there's an article I wrote recently about libido in the boardroom, that maybe a board member is not as attractive as he thinks he is to a secretary. But basically, because he's in a very powerful position, the secretary laughs at his jokes and whatever it might be. So they should become more aware of it. And it really brings me also to the question that, is it not possible? You have team coaching. I've done a lot of team coaching, trying to make more effective executive boards, executive teams. But it's not a one-off. It would be good if boards, executives, you make it a habit, maybe once a month, to have a somewhat kind of offsite in which you spend a few hours, talk about the elephants in the room, the difficult questions. And what you need for that is safe space, which means it is a very important role. I was lucky in a way, because many of the interventions I did was with people I had as students. When they went to my CEO recycling seminar, it was a working alliance and working relationship. Any form of therapy, well, the main thing is, do you have a good relationship with your therapist? If you have a bad relationship with therapist, you hit your head against the wall for a long time. You can learn something, but it's not the best way to go. So there was an element of trust, there was an element of safety, and the person knew that I was not trying to mess up her situation. It was not going to be the best interest at heart. So that is very important, how to manage in that case. When you do those kind of sessions, you might sometimes also need a facilitator to make it work. Otherwise, but to give the opportunity that, apart from talking about strategy, new opportunities, risks, and things like that, also talk about, and that takes also a question you were raising before about emotional intelligence, to help them to become a little bit more emotional sensitive. Also, to make them aware of the role each plays. I remember years ago, the intervention for an investment bank, I used the 360, one of my 360 instruments, the Leadership Archetype Questionnaire. And they were great deal makers, they were real strategists, etc. But they were lousy in coaching each other and things like that. And just there was a start of a conversation. What can we do? They hired at the time somebody from Boston Consulting Group, I remember, to take on that role. Said something is lacking in our team. To really, and that coming back also the questions raised by you, Maureen, about the darker side and the shadow side. I mean, I don't see it as a darker side or shadow side. It's part of you, who you are. The question is that you recognize it. You should recognize what you're good at and not so good at.
Some of our listeners probably don't know the term shadow side. Can you give a little insight to what that means?
It has become a very famous term used. It was started by Jung, Carl Jung, as you know. And basically it has to do with the parts of yourself you don't really so much, to say it in a simplistic way, you're uncomfortable with. Now, things you don't want to see of yourself, but it's part of you. And if you start to put it, so some people, I remember some of my students, they were just gentlemen and ladies, said, I put them all in boxes, I want to see it. But I tell them, you do that, it will jump out without you knowing it. And better have some control over it and know what your weaknesses are. And maybe also when you talk about the kind of alignment of an executive team, to see what should be added or should be subtracted. I use sometimes a very simple 2 by 2. Don't like, important, not important. So don't like, not important. I see some of the micromanagers spending too much time there. And he says, listen, know your priorities. Don't be there. Then you have not important. Go fishing. My best ideas are not when I sit behind my desk here, but I'm a walk in Jardin de Luxembourg, the park, or lie in the bathtub, Archimedes, whatever. I get ideas. I know when I get in the bathtub for a long time, I get an idea. But also just walking, doing other things. So like, not important. Then you have don't like, but important. Now, I've written many books. And if you've written a book, after a while, the publishers come with queries. I hate queries because the publishers are very slow. That is 8 months later. I'm somewhere else. I had one woman, one woman who kept on pestering me. And at the end of her, and I answered her questions. I was very polite. And I said to her, "Do you do some private work?" She said, "Yes, I know I'm a terrier." And so now, with the books I'm writing at the moment, the terrier talks to the terrier. So I'm out of it. She takes care of it all. It's fantastic. And by the year, it should be. And coming back, like important. And you should realize, and that's important about self-knowledge, where can I really make a contribution in the team? What am I really good at? Where can I really add value? And unfortunately, coming back to the executive, the micromanager, who is wasting his time on a lot of things he shouldn't be wasting time. But he has actually this progress. He appointed the chief of staff. It just happened. I was so happy yesterday. He really is making progress. Things are happening. But my fear is now that he gets too much time on his hand. When you think about what I try to do, I want people to become more self-aware. So having creating self-knowledge, which I think is an important factor, to become more reflective leaders that I'm trying to create. Then I want to help them to build a more effective team, which is usually most top executive teams are very dysfunctional. And then I want them also to create a great place to work. I actually introduced a concept called the authentic organization, which is a new word I introduced in the management language, which actually is an amalgamation of two Greek words. Greeks are pretty good in those things. Authentikos and zotikos, but basically a place where you feel alive. Because when you think about some of the studies, Gallup, I think 85% of employees worldwide are not engaged. What are they doing? Sleepwalking through your organization? It's terrible. Think about if you can keep them alive, make them alive, that you're excited, and you get so much more out of the people. And then, of course, the end is also that I want people to have a life, somewhat of a balanced life. That there's no such thing as a split between your personal life and your public life. It is so much interrelated. So that's the kind of things I try to do. I talked a lot, huh? And one big monologue I gave you.
And that's self-awareness. So a lot with our clients, we do alignment sessions and then coaching with the same people. So there's an ongoing connection, and the coaching isn't necessarily traditional coaching. It's also helping with alignment, helping with staying on track with the strategy, any number of things, not limited to just coaching. And I found that helps in some cases. When they're ready, they can deal with the inner questions. In some cases, they're either less safe or less open to dealing with what's going on inside. And in those cases, working on the outer work is still efficient. Not as efficient as navigating the inner, but I'm curious your thoughts on that approach.
I am a terrible coach. I tell them they're idiots. I give them homework. I ask about their sex life. I'm all over the place. But it makes for a very good relationship, and they listen. Now, you're very right. Before you can do that, you have to start from the outside, go to the inside. That is probably a safer approach. So that's what I try to do. It's partially in my psychoanalytic training that some of the kind of supervisors I had could be quite rough in getting to where you want to be. I think I can get away with it at this point in my life. Maybe it's my age. I can get away with certain questions which would be not acceptable when I was probably much younger. That's when this element of, when you talk about transferential thing, that there must be something there. They say to someone, the person asked that. But, I find an important slogan, welcome the neurosis. Meaning that sometimes you get such crazy reactions at what is going on. And what's going on is the thing is there's a term also in psychoanalysis, which is the psychodynamic systemic, used now, overusing it. It comes from Kets. It's negative capability. I don't know if you ever heard it, negative capability. What I mean by that is when I would do my CEO seminar, it would take 21 people that I could handle at the same time. 21, and have a colleague with me. But at times there were situations that, what the hell is going on? But I've learned in the past, of course, when you get anxious, you want closure. Now I've learned, let it be, let it be, let them muck on. But in the end, they're smart enough to come to some form of closure. So, but you have to be, it's very difficult, the tension, what's going on there, to let it be. But that's negative capability, to be able to, when you say, my God, I have no clue what's going on here anymore. I'm complete confused, but let it be, let it be. And so also when you get some strange comments, when coming welcome in the roses, said, what is going on? Also the people who fight the most, argue the most about certain issues, are the ones who are going to be your biggest defenders in the end. That's very painful in the beginning. He said, my God, what a pain in the neck this person is, opposed to the person who's happily nodding his or her head, but maybe half asleep. It's very hard to fall asleep in my class, by the way. I don't let them fall asleep.
They're
But
disengaged. They're part of the
no,
85%.
I'm dangerous. I'm really dangerous. I mean, I was recently, I was in Seoul. And so there was, I think, 1,000 people in the audience. And I was in the front row because the first speaker was, I think, the dean of a well-known business school in the United States. I'm not going to mention. He drowned on about what else? AI for an hour and a half. And in good Korean tradition, there was no break. And he said, my God, I'm next in line. And look back and saw the half asleep audience, are mostly men sitting there, many with also microphones in the ear because they speak English properly. So I looked around and said, who has no microphone in his ear? So I went on the podium, stood on the podium, said hello, I was introduced, and then I walked down from the podium, picked one character and said, what did you dream about last night? And suddenly everybody woke up. What crazy dreams did you have last night? Did you have any sexual dreams or so? And he got more and more awake. Then I rushed up to the end of the audience because people in the back, they sit in the back so they can escape. Aha, no. And said, and what about you? And so then he saw this man is dangerous. Everybody was suddenly awake. And so we got going. But that's theater in a way. That is theater because you give a speech, you have to get the audience. As long as they pick up a few ideas, that's what hopefully someone, because to really help people change is hard work. It's hard work and you have to be, because people fall easily back on their old patterns, particularly when they regress so quickly. So you have to, that's the reason I was talking about the idea that if you do an intervention for a team intervention to create a better team, to just let it be as a one-off, it's a little bit of a waste of money. You have to need a follow-up and then maybe a regular refresher to make it work, that you have real serious conversations about issues which are really there. When you have two baronies in an executive team and they're starting to fight, sometimes you realize that some people in the executive team shouldn't be there. I don't like it.
Yeah.
I don't like it, but because I like them to be intact. I'm not a great reaper, but there are times I say this person should not be there. It is completely dysfunctional and destroys the atmosphere in the working alignments team. But it means also you need to have meaningful conversations. And actually, I started to experiment with team coaching many years ago. The ones where where I did it was actually two well-known American companies. One was Goldman Sachs, one was McKinsey. McKinsey always prided themselves, or the directors of McKinsey, of being the best in leadership team. One in Singapore, one in New York, one in Chicago, and one in Berlin. And you have to come together very quickly. And to make it, and it's very hard to email a smile or a handshake. So to really, the ability to have authentic conversations and talk about the issues is important. And so this was a training ground for being able to do that. And so it was actually a shotgun marriage I had with a man at Harvard, Bob Keegan. I don't know if you've heard of him.
I know Bob.
Yeah, Bob, yeah. So I got a shotgun marriage because I got three of the people who run the leadership development for a program at McKinsey came into my office and said, do you like to do this together with Bob? I didn't know Bob Keegan at the time, but so we worked a long time together. And of course, what they liked at McKinsey was his immunity to change. It was really structured. How to change people. When you come to a micromanager, and you give them feedback to a micromanager, say, listen, you have to delegate more, you have to empower people, etc., etc. And then they say, yeah. And the next year is the same thing again, because nobody does it so well as they do. And it's fear that a mistake can be made. And so this immunity to change idea of Bob is a little bit of a way of trying to wean those people away of that particular behavior. Being very structured. And this is actually, Bob doesn't like it very much. I think actually there's a lot of psychoanalytic thought behind that, when you're very honest about it. But
You
he
know
doesn't.
his
But he doesn't like that so much. I think that has to do with
if you know his work, it's grounded in ego development,
yeah.
right? And so, having done this with grad students and clients alike, one of the comments I get back on the immunities to change work is this is a lot like going to my therapist. It's just done in a corporate setting.
Don't say that to Bob. That he doesn't like that very much. No, but he's.
This
I
is
really. He's a great teacher. He's a real nice guy. I really enjoyed working with him. I wonder he's still working with McKinsey. I don't.
the immunities to change tool is one of the more effective, very challenging, but more effective that I have personally used with leaders.
No, I think it helps. Given many of their mindset, it helps them. They had a more difficult time with the other parts of coming back to Bob's ideas about the adult stages of development and things like that. Self. That was more difficult for them. But anyhow, where are we? Yeah, I derailed because I was trying to explain to you how I got into team coaching and what really was in the beginning. But I was at the beginning of this coaching trend. Now everybody in the kitchen sink is a coach, which is a problem, of course. That's another story. But at the time, team coaching was a tricky business. People were very reluctant to enter that. The group dynamics should take place. Although I'm not a group dynamics person, I never. Of course, you have a lot of people who do the group dynamics, the Tavistock tradition. I know a lot of people, but I'm not part of that. I guess you had, what's his name, Ron Heifetz as a candidate, also not in leadership. I remember he would stand in front of a group of people. You can do with certain people, not with people at Goldman Sachs, by the way, to stand there and say nothing for a while. We have a bunch of traders who are totally activity driven. You stand there and do nothing. After a while, they go buy bananas. And that's not what they were. Not, but of course, the students I had, you can do it. There was a student, I set up a master program at INSEAD about change. There you can do it. That's okay. They have the kind of capacity of tolerance for pain. But you need to know your audience. I model onward. That's what I do. When you go there and look at stage theory, I was influenced by John Bowlby, about the separation and loss. And of course, that was what's the name? Kübler-Ross took that up
Yeah.
she basically stole this idea from Bowlby, I think. That's my ideas from Bowlby, and she made it a little bit more dramatic. And must admit, in some of my writing, I also have used linearity, but life is not so simple as that. It is a general guideline, maybe, but it's more complex than that. I see people who look very mature, suddenly totally regress in certain situations and so I think the important thing in life is to be able, that's I try to explain to my students, to be able to recognize when you use very primitive defense mechanisms. And the most primitive ones are splitting and projection. Splitting, projection, denial. I didn't do it, he did it, or she did it. And splitting, the people with the white cowboy hats and the black cowboy hats. And I think one sign of maturity, you see so many executives doing that, and politicians are very good in it, and your leading politician is a master in it, of splitting. Now, the sign of emotional maturity is to see that, to have the tolerance for ambiguity. That I think that you can see the good and some of the bad side of. My bad side of a person. We all have our coming back to the shadow side, but also say, listen, the person did lots of good. Now, I have had coming back to my CEO seminar, I've had people who had a terrible childhood. And you say, how did they manage? So the one thing could be that the parents could have been all bad. But very often that's not the only thing, but also sometimes I've also been in situations which are horrendous, which are incestuous situations. You say, my God, how does this woman got out of it? Very often it has to do also with there is one in their lives was some support figures. It could be a teacher, it could be an older brother, whatever it might be, or uncle, whatever it might be, that believed grandmothers are very important. Yeah, it's very important, particularly in Russia, by the way, because it was interesting. I was finding that they tended, at least after perestroika, many of them they married very young to get out of the house. And then, of course, and then they got pregnant, and then they dumped the child at their mother. So they were really brought up, many of the children were brought up by the grandmothers. I listen to stories, that's what I do, to people's stories, and particularly in the leadership program I would be running for so long, that people who come from terrible backgrounds, really traumatic backgrounds, how do they end up in my seminar? There must be so much resilience. And in spite of the horrible background, when you listen to what they had, maybe it was, in one way you can say, maybe, and in this case, the parents might have done something well, but very often there are some other figures around. And important figures are figures like, it could be a teacher who believes in the young woman or the young man that there's some talent there, an older brother or sister, or grandparents. A grandparent who can play in some cultures a very important role. Since I got many students from Russia at the time, not anymore at the moment, given the craziness going on there, their grandmothers have played a very important role because many would marry very young and then dump the child with the grandparents. But I see it also here. We have a woman who does some of the housework and from the Philippines. And basically, her children are raised by the grandparents. I just came from Namibia. I was there this week. Seeing how many people are unemployed to find an opportunity somewhere else. They're desperate.
You've written probably 1,000 articles and stacks of books.
There are many books.
A lot of books with the terriers. In this conversation, specifically thinking about leaders, inner theater, and organizational systems, what do you want leaders to be thinking about themselves and the systems they're creating?
It would be good if they would create the space in the organization where they can reflect regularly on issues which are not immediate and long-term issues, which also has to do with how well are we working together and what can we do to be more effective together. Psychoanalysts talk about false self and true self, and in a way we always are engaged in a performance. When I teach, when I stand in front of an audience, I make a performance. I'm not going to tell my deepest concerns necessarily, but you can at least be as authentic as possible. But if you are in the position of CEO, there are a lot of secrets. You can even tell the close circle around you. That's the reason also it is not so bad for many. It sounds very trite, but many CEOs are actually quite lonely people. To have somebody to talk to. It sounds so trite, the loneliness of command, but it's true. And sometimes they're lucky. They have a good partner they can talk to. And as a good partner can tell you you're full of shit at times. I make the comment sometimes, every leader needs a fool. The kings had fools, but of course the fools eventually were beheaded. And the same thing is, how long can a person who plays that role of the fool, the truth-sayer, the fool of King Lear, survive in an organization? I also tell people, please don't be a hungry consultant, because then you're part of the establishment there. Be able to tell the person how things stand. Coming back to the word we talked about earlier, hubris, because that's the pitfall. Narcissism can be a treasure, but also can be an enormous spoiler. And that's one should always, is very delicate balance. And that's particularly for the top executive in an organization, a very tricky thing. And unfortunately, when you talk about top executives, and boards are getting a little bit more effective, I think, partially because more and more people, for example, at our school, we have one of the most successful executive programs, the board program, in which people start to learn more about the psychological dynamics that's going on in board. But in the past, boards, basically people who are retired as senior executives and don't get enough information very often, because all the information, I'm on board on the last moment, and it's like sitting on eggshells. You try to, it's a little performance. And even though you see that something is not right, because you have been in the same position, you let it be, and you let it be until it becomes a scandal. It's a catastrophe theory very often, and that should be avoided. You should really do some preemptive maintenance, not to have that happen. So to have also create space on a regular basis in organization of reflection, that's the reason that you might need a facilitator for that. I'm not looking for a job, by the way. That's not what I'm saying. But you have to also manage the CEO, because there is always this transferential factor, and so the CEO should not speak up too early, depending on the culture. And of course, you have to look at different filters. But I always say you have to be a CEO in America is very different from being so in Russia. To be a CEO in Sweden is very different than to be a CEO in the UK. There are different rules of the game. And then the industry makes a difference. There's different filters you have to think. And then you have when you have the managing partner of McKinsey, which I knew a few of them, It's a very different role than running a steel factory in the Caucasus.
Mhm.
You have to keep that in perspective. That certain parameters don't work there to make that work. So anyhow, but as I said before, to repeat myself, which I do regularly, is many executive teams are not well aligned, and it is extremely costly. If you don't have to sing a company song, which IBM used to have, and some, I didn't know there was a whole book of songs about Watson. It was really crazy. I got also a whole book with songs about how great he was. Tried to talk about the inbred culture at one point in time until Gessner came. Can an elephant dance? But there should be room for robust dialogue, honest dialogue, not little political games and things like that. And how to look all the time at what's the best interest of the whole organization.
Yeah.
And that's very often not the case because sub-optimization is then taking place and who gets the resources, etc., etc.
What is the one choice you believe senior leaders or boards should make in the next 30 days?
The willingness to accept feedback. It's funny. I find the coaches are the worst people to be willing to receive feedback. They're in the feedback business, but do they want to have feedback themselves? Not really. You have all the different ways of deflecting that. But the ability to, for example, one of the most difficult people in an organization are people with psychopathic behavior. And they're very good in managing upward. They're very good in that. So they really tell you what you want to hear.
Yeah.
But the people who notice it are below. They know it. So on certain 360s on a regular basis, even though it's also culture specific. Remember when I started with 360, it was so long ago, and it was no problem for the United States, no problem for Sweden, for Holland, but for France, they only give feedback down. Up, that's not. So you need a culture where the people are willing to give solid feedback. But if that's there, it is very helpful to basically tease out certain people, say, listen, do I want this person in the organization? He pulls fast on people, he takes credit for other people's work, etc., etc. And it's a typical thing, again, coming back to my 2x2s. I had a like, dislike, and important, but you also have results and living the values. So you have people who have great results but don't live the values. And those are the toxic people because you let them be too long. And those have to be taken out. Or they have to be told unless you shape up, otherwise you're out. But they stay too long and they're toxic. This person in Greece who has fantastic results, but nobody stays there. So that kind of thing. And something has to be done. But people, he's a producer. That's a nice word. He's a producer. He produces. And so they let it be. And that's, again, those questions should be raised. And if you create this kind of reflective space on a regular basis, with some kind of, you will save a lot of money. That's what it means. In the end, if you as a consultant or coach or whatever, you have to talk about dollars and cents. They said, listen, if your team is not aligned, it's going to be extremely costly. It will cost you so much money. And so that's where you have to go. The same thing when you have a toxic person sitting there, destroying the culture of the company and really making reputational damage. Better do something about it. And we even talked about the libido. We talked about it earlier, the off libido element, where people see certain totally inappropriate behavior in the organization, and they say, yeah, this is just the way it is, and ignore it till it finally explodes. And then it comes to the Wall Street Journal, and you see there, and then you have to pay millions and millions of damages.
It so totally connects with what you've said about power, that as someone elevates, people junior to them don't feel the freedom, and the leader often doesn't recognize that their position of power is impacting. That's the thing that's interesting. They don't realize they're influencing in a way they often don't intend, right? They see people responding and don't realize they're manipulating, not collaborating.
Now you have people coming to the office and ask the secretary, how is his mood today? Can I talk to them? As the leader of an organization on stage, people carefully look at you, what you do. There's an enormous amount of symbolic action taking place. And that, I think, leaders should become more aware of it. The symbolic role they play, the element of the transferential processes, because in how people deal with authority, and they say, no, we're very democratic. In the meantime, they might be the Louis XIV, the Sun King. People think this. So you should be aware of it, greater aware of it. And also learning how to listen, really listen, the active listening. But people say certain things, but how do they say it? In what way do they say it? This person asks, how is this person doing? He's doing okay, but... So what do you mean by but? What is going on? Is there anything you're concerned about? And most people don't listen very well because they're too busy. They have the response and they hold on to the response. While they're holding on to the response, they don't listen anymore. They have this brilliant response to make. So that's of course very interesting when you're on a CEO class, when you have 21 people who used to talk all the time, they cannot talk at the same time. So they have to put a hand up and there's a sequence. So that's actually an interesting exercise already automatically. You have to listen to the others. Actually, I had one person in my class once who was chairman of the board. She loved to talk. And every time she raised her hand, I had been fair. She had raised her hand, it was her turn. But I said, my God, there we go again. We have because I only have so much time. A long monologue is going to happen. And the next module, she came back, not a peep. Not a word. So I got worried about her. What is happening to her mental health? So I went to her after class, said, Maria, not her name, not her real name. What's happening to you? She said, my colleagues in the class told me I not listened very well. I talked too much. I didn't do anything. My colleagues took care of it. It's actually sometimes the advantage of team coaching. It is not team coaching, it's group coaching because the people come from different companies. So they're much more, team is a different, much trickier thing. But the group, so they told her, listen, you should listen more. You talk too much. Be more specific. That can be the good thing of group coaching. The other group, they can become friends forever. That's what happens actually. Many of them can know each other so well, they see each other every year and see each other in their countries and things like that.
So Manfred, this has been fascinating, both the pre-recording and this. And I can see that we could have many more conversations. I typically try to summarize. I'm going to hit a couple of high points.
Good luck.
So a few things I heard, though, from the systemic level. Do 360s, do them consistently, and understand the context. So have the person debriefing, not just give the feedback, but use it in service of team alignment. And so conduct both solid team alignment sessions, not just on the strategy, but on the team dynamics. Do the 360 to help people develop self-awareness, which was your first phrase. And for people in power, there's certainly a certain amount of hubris and ego, self-confidence required. Beyond that level, it's diminishing returns and damaging.
Very, very much. I can remember again Lord Acton's statement, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And he is so right. When a person becomes the businessman or woman of the year, sell the shares.
So that would be interesting to look at SpaceX.
No comment.
So thank you so much. Where would people, you probably have a whole category on Amazon of your work. Where would people find you and follow your most recent thoughts?
I've been publishing too much. I'm actually working on 7 books at the same time. It's pretty crazy. I write quite a few essays and I put them also on Medium and on LinkedIn. That's where they are. So that's the way to find them. And then of course they are, eventually what I do is I put them together as a book. That's the reason I have so many books at the same time, because I've been writing prolifically. It must be my manic defense or something like that about certain things. But I enjoy playing with ideas. What I try to do is this, I always have this, you call it the starfish analogy, the story of starfish of the person. And so if I can help, the world is not in great shape at the moment, as you all see, look around, there's all these wars and all this craziness. And if I can make it a little bit better, and I don't do it with a gun, I do it with a pen, or actually with the computer, to help people a little bit to realize the effects or the consequence of their actions, and to become more aware of it. That's my fantasy, of course. If you have a little bit more self-knowledge, maybe you would think a little bit before you do certain things. Maybe you're a little bit more reflective. That's really coming back to my comment about how to create reflective leadership. And reflective people in general, not just leaders, but anybody.
Yeah.
And it also has to do, again, coming back also to your comments about parenting, helping people to be aware, if you are a parent, what it means, that the responsibility you have to create a secure base for the children. We're coming back to the ideas of Bowlby. If you have a secure base, you can go whistling through life. Otherwise, you have to work. If that not happens early in life, you have to do a lot of work afterwards. The people become greater awareness with. So I guess probably it's easy for me now to say as a grandfather, but still, this is to make a small contribution to create a little bit of a better world.
I love the focus on self-awareness. So thank you. Thank you to our listeners. Please like us, share us, follow Manfred on LinkedIn or Medium, follow us on LinkedIn, and leverage what you learn each week to make the impact each of us can individually make, because it actually really matters right now.
Thank you for having me.